Welcome to Horrified Stories, where fear comes to life. Don't forget to like, share, and subscribe for more spine-chilling tales. Let's start our today's story. Don't Look Back, a true tale from the woods. The woods stretched endlessly, their dark canopy blotting out the moonlight. They were ancient, whispering secrets only the wind could understand. For generations, people in the nearby town of Black Hollow had warned their children, don't go into the woods after dark, and whatever you do, don't look back. The warnings were treated like folklore, a story to scare rebellious teens into staying home. But those who ventured into the woods spoke of strange noises, whispers that seemed to come from nowhere, and the unnerving sensation of being watched. Most dismissed these tales as overactive imaginations or practical jokes, until someone didn't come back. It started with Adam Callahan, a quiet, dependable man in his mid-30s. Adam had been known for his meticulous routines. Every evening, he would jog along the edge of the woods before returning home. But one crisp October evening, he didn't come back. The next morning, his wife, Megan, called the police. They searched the jogging path and the surrounding woods, but found no trace of him. His phone, wallet, and keys were left untouched on the kitchen counter, as though he planned to return. The town buzzed with speculation. Maybe he'd run away, or perhaps it was a wild animal attack. But Megan insisted Adam wasn't the kind of man to disappear without a word. A week later, another person went missing, Ellie Hansen, a high school senior who'd gone for a walk in the woods with her dog. The dog returned home alone, whimpering and covered in mud. Ellie was never seen again. The disappearances continued, sporadic but consistent enough to send a ripple of fear through Black Hollow. Soon, the woods were no longer a place for evening strolls or childhood adventures. By the time the story begins, the woods had become a forbidden zone for most of the townsfolk. But every town has its thrill seekers, those who dare to challenge the warnings and embrace the unknown. That's how Sarah, James, Mia, and Ethan found themselves standing at the edge of the woods one chilly Friday night. "This is a bad idea," Sarah said, her arms crossed tightly over her chest. "Come on, Sarah," James replied with a grin. "We're just going to walk to the old clearing and back. It'll take 20 minutes, tops." Mia chimed in, her tone teasing. "What's the worst that could happen? We've all heard the stories, but nobody really knows what's out there." Ethan, who'd been quiet up until now, finally spoke. "It's just a bunch of trees. Besides, it'll make for a great story later." Sarah sighed. She didn't want to seem like a coward, but everything in her gut was telling her to stay behind. Still, she followed her friends as they stepped into the woods, their laughter echoing through the trees. The group moved deeper into the forest, the canopy above thick enough to block out most of the moonlight. James led the way, his flashlight cutting through the darkness. After about 15 minutes, they reached the clearing. It was an open patch of land surrounded by towering oaks, their gnarled branches reaching toward the sky. In the center stood a weathered stone marker, covered in moss and barely legible. "What is that?" Mia asked, stepping closer. "It's a boundary marker," Ethan said. "Probably from when the town was first founded. They used these to mark property lines." James ran his hand over the stone. "There's something carved here," he said, squinting in the dim light. He traced the letters with his fingers, reading aloud. "Leave this place. Do not look back." A chill ran down Sarah's spine. "Okay, we've seen it. Can we go now?" But James wasn't ready to leave. He pulled out his phone and started taking pictures. "This is awesome. I bet no one's been here in decades." "James, stop," Sarah said. "This place doesn't feel right." James rolled his eyes but pocketed his phone. "Fine, let's go." As they turned to leave, the wind picked up, rustling the leaves overhead. It sounded almost like whispering. The walk back felt longer, the air heavier. Sarah kept glancing over her shoulder, feeling an unshakable sense of being watched. "Did anyone else hear that?" she asked, her voice trembling. "Hear what?" James replied. "Whispering," she said. Like someone's following us." Mia laughed nervously. "It's just the wind, Sarah. Don't psych yourself out." But Ethan looked uneasy. "I heard it too," he admitted. The group quickened their pace, their laughter fading into nervous silence. The path seemed unfamiliar now, the trees closer together. "I swear this isn't the way we came," James said, stopping abruptly. "It has to be," Mia replied. "We've been walking straight the whole time." "Then why does everything look different?" Sarah asked, her voice rising. Before anyone could answer, a sharp crack echoed through the woods. They frowned, their flashlights starting toward the source of the sound. "Probably just a branch," Ethan said, though his voice lacked conviction. They started walking again, faster this time. The whispering returned, louder now, and distinctly human. The group broke into a run, their flashlights bouncing wildly as they tried to navigate the uneven ground. The whispers grew louder, more insistent, as though they were coming from just behind them. "Don't look back," Ethan shouted, his voice breaking with panic. Sarah's heart raced, her instincts screaming at her to glance over her shoulder. But she didn't. None of them did. They burst out of the woods and into the open field near the town's edge. The whispers stopped abruptly, leaving an eerie silence in their wake. James doubled over, panting. "What the hell was that?" "I don't know," Mia said, her face pale. "But we're not going back." Sarah turned to look at the woods, now a dark mass against the night sky. For a moment, she thought she saw something, a figure standing just inside the tree line. But when she blinked, it was gone. The group didn't talk much after that night. They avoided each other at school and around town, as though speaking about what had happened might bring it back. But things didn't go back to normal. Sarah started hearing whispers in her house late at night, faint but unmistakable. Mia stopped showing up to school altogether, claiming she was sick. Ethan, once the most laid back of the group, became jumpy and paranoid. And James vanished 2 weeks later. His car was found abandoned near the edge of the woods, the driver's side door hanging open. His phone was on the seat, still recording. The video was only 2 seconds long. It showed James standing at the edge of the woods, his flashlight trembling in his hand. Then he turned to look back, and he was gone. After James's disappearance, fear gripped the small town of Black Hollow. The woods had always carried a dark reputation, but now the warnings seemed painfully real. People spoke in hushed tones, whispering about curses, spirits, or something far worse lurking among the trees. For Sarah, Mia, and Ethan, the disappearance hit close to home. James was more than just a friend. It was a reminder of what they had seen and heard that night. They had returned from the woods, but something had followed them back. They couldn't ignore it anymore. In the days following James's disappearance, Sarah's unease grew unbearable. The whispers that had plagued her since that night in the woods were no longer confined to the darkness. She heard them everywhere, soft, indistinct murmurs that seemed to come from just out of reach. At first, she tried to ignore them, chalking it up to stress and exhaustion. But the whispers weren't alone. Objects in her house began moving on their own. Doors creaked open in the dead of night. Shadows flitted across her peripheral vision. On the 3rd night after James vanished, Sarah woke to find her bedroom window wide open. Even though she was sure she had locked it, cold air spilled into the room, carrying with it the faint scent of damp earth. And then she heard it, a single, clear whisper. "Come back." Sarah bolted upright, her heart pounding. She grabbed her phone and called Mia. Mia had been avoiding everyone since their trip to the woods. She hadn't been to school, and she barely responded to texts or calls. When Sarah finally got through to her, she sounded distant, almost dazed. "Mia, are you okay?" Sarah asked. There was a long pause. Then, in a shaky voice, Mia replied, "They won't leave me alone." "Who?" "The whispers," Mia said. "They're everywhere. I can't sleep." "Sarah, and I keep seeing things, faces in the windows, shadows in the corners of my room. It's like they're waiting for something." Sarah's stomach churned. "We need to talk. I'll come over." "No," Mia shouted, her voice frantic. "Don't come here. It's not safe." Before Sarah could press her further, the call disconnected. Ethan was the only one of the group who hadn't shut himself away, but his behavior was far from normal. He had become obsessed with the woods, spending hours researching local legends and old maps of the area. When Sarah visited him, his room was cluttered with papers, books, and newspaper clippings. "Ethan, what are you doing?" she asked, scanning the chaos. "I'm trying to figure out what's happening," he said, his voice tight with frustration. "There's something about those woods, Sarah, something people have been hiding for a long time." He handed her a faded newspaper clipping. The headline read, "Local family disappears without a trace on 1956. "It's not just us," Ethan said. "People have been vanishing near those woods for decades, maybe even longer, and no one talks about it." Sarah's hands trembled as she read the article. It described a family of 4 who had gone missing after a picnic near the woods. The only thing left behind was their car, parked at the edge of the tree line. "There's more," Ethan said, pulling out a journal. This belonged to a man named Robert Harlan. He was a reporter in the 1970s, investigating the disappearances. He wrote about strange lights in the woods, people hearing whispers, and he hesitated. And what? Sarah pressed. Ethan looked at her, his expression grim, and people who looked back. Despite Mia's protests, Sarah decided to visit her. She couldn't stand the thought of her friend facing this alone. When she arrived at Mia's house, the curtains were drawn, and the place looked abandoned. Sarah knocked on the door, but there was no answer. She tried the handlight was unlocked. Inside, the house was eerily quiet. The air felt heavy, oppressive, as though the walls themselves were watching her. Mia, Sarah called out, her voice echoing. She found Mia in her bedroom, sitting on the floor with her back against the wall. Her eyes were bloodshot, and her hands trembled as she clutched a blanket around her shoulders. "They're here," Mia whispered, staring at something Sarah couldn't see. "Mia, it's just me," Sarah said, kneeling beside her. "No," Mia said, shaking her head. "They're always here, watching, waiting." Before Sarah could respond, Mia grabbed her arm with surprising strength. "Don't look back," she said, her voice urgent. "No matter what happens, no matter what you heard, don't look back." After leaving Mia's house, Sarah called Ethan and told him what had happened. "We need to figure this out," she said. "Mia's falling apart, and I'm not far behind. You said people have been investigating this for years. What did they find?" The basement was pitch black, the air damp and suffocating. Their flashlights barely cut through the darkness, revealing walls covered in more of the strange carvings. The whispers were deafening now, and the figures were at the door, pounding against it with inhuman strength. "What do we do?" Sarah asked, her voice shaking. Ethan pointed to a trapdoor in the floor. "That must lead out. Help me open it." Together, they pried the trapdoor open, revealing a dark tunnel that seemed to stretch endlessly into the earth. They climbed down into the tunnel, the walls cold and damp. The whispers followed them, echoing unnaturally through the narrow space. As they moved deeper, they noticed the carvings on the walls became more intricate, depicting strange, humanoid figures surrounded by swirling patterns. "What is this place?" Sarah whispered. "I think it's part of the altar," Ethan said. "Maybe this is where it all started." The tunnel seemed to go on forever, twisting and turning until they lost all sense of direction. The air grew colder, and the whispers more coherent. "You shouldn't be here. You shouldn't have come." At last, the tunnel opened into a vast underground chamber. In the center was another altar, larger and more ornate than the one in the clearing. Around it stood more shadowy figures, their glowing eyes fixed on Sarah and Ethan. Ethan stepped forward, holding up the journal. "We know what you are," he shouted. "We know what you've done." The figures didn't respond. Instead, the whispers grew louder, swirling around them like a storm. Sarah felt her strength draining, her vision blurring. She dropped to her knees, unable to resist the pull of the whispers. And then, she heard it, a voice, clear and distinct, cutting through the chaos. "Don't look back." Sarah and Ethan had ventured farther than anyone else ever dared. They'd uncovered ancient carvings, found Robert Harlan's journal, and now stood in an underground chamber that seemed to pulse with a life of its own. The shadowy figures surrounded them, their glowing eyes piercing the suffocating darkness. But the whispers were the worst. They crawled into Sarah's mind, unraveling her thoughts and sapping her will to fight. The faint echo of a warning, "Don't look back," was all that tethered her to reality. Time was running out, and if they didn't find a way to escape, they would join the countless others who had vanished into the woods, leaving no trace. The shadowy figures stood in a circle around the altar, their glowing eyes fixed on Sarah and Ethan. The whispers had shifted, no longer a cacophony but a single, unified voice that seemed to speak directly to them. "You came here seeking answers. You will not leave." Ethan stumbled backward, gripping Sarah's arm. "We have to go," he whispered, his voice shaking. Sarah nodded, but her legs felt like lead. The whispers were inside her head now, unraveling her memories, filling her with an overwhelming sense of dread. The shadows began to close in, their movements slow and deliberate. Ethan pulled Sarah toward the far side of the chamber, where another tunnel seemed to lead out. "This way," he shouted, tugging her forward. As they ran, the whispers grew louder, turning into a roar that made it impossible to think. The tunnel twisted and turned, narrowing in places until they had to crawl on their hands and knees. Behind them, the shadows followed, their glowing eyes illuminating the dark. "Keep going," Ethan urged, his voice barely audible over the whispers. They emerged into another chamber, smaller than the last but equally ominous. The walls were covered in carving symbols, figures, and what looked like a map. Ethan pulled out the journal, flipping through the pages frantically. "There's got to be something in here, a way to stop this." Sarah leaned against the wall, her breathing ragged. The whispers hadn't stopped, and she could feel the shadows getting closer. Ethan found a passage that seemed relevant. The altar is the source, but it is also the key. To break the cycle, one must destroy it, but the cost is great. The woods do not give free like they take. Sarah's eyes widened. Destroy the altar? We don't even have anything, to. A loud crash interrupted her. The shadows had reached the entrance to the chamber, their glowing eyes cutting through the darkness. We don't have time to think, Ethan said, pulling Sarah to her feet. We have to try. The tunnel led them back to the first chamber, where the large altar stood. The shadowy figures had multiplied, surrounding the altar and blocking any possible exit. Ethan clutched the journal tightly. We have to destroy it, he said. Sarah stared at the altar, her mind racing. The carvings on its surface seemed to shift and writhe, as though alive. She asked, her voice trembling. Before Ethan could answer, the shadows surged forward. Stay behind me, he shouted, grabbing a loose rock from the ground and hurling it at the altar. The rock struck the surface, and the entire chamber trembled. The whispers rose to a deafening roar, and the shadows recoiled, their forms flickering. It's working, Ethan shouted. Ethan grabbed another rock, slamming it into the altar with all his strength. Cracks began to form along its surface, glowing faintly with an eerie light. But as the altar began to break, the shadows grew more frantic. They surged towards Sarah and Ethan, their movements erratic and desperate. One of them lunged at Sarah, its glowing eyes inches from her face. She closed her eyes, remembering Mia's warning. Don't look back. Keep going, she screamed, her voice filled with both fear and determination. Ethan delivered another blow to the altar, and this time, it shattered. The room was filled with a blinding light, and the whisper stopped abruptly. For a moment, there was silence. And then, a single, clear voice spoke. The cost must be paid. The light began to fade, revealing the chamber once more. The shadows were gone, but the air felt heavy, charged with an unnatural energy. Ethan dropped the journal, staring at the broken altar. We did it, he said, his voice barely above a whisper. But Sarah wasn't so sure. The carvings on the walls were still glowing, and the voice echoed again. The cost must be paid. Ethan turned to Sarah, his face pale. It's me, he said. It's asking for me. No, Sarah said, shaking her head. We'll find another way. Well, there is no other way, Ethan said. The journal said the woods take. They've been taking people for years. If I don't stay, it'll take both of you or worse. Tears streamed down Sarah's face. Ethan, no, we can figure this out together. Ethan smiled faintly. You have to go. Sarah, you have to get out of here. Don't look back.
Keep going, she screamed, her voice filled with both fear and determination. Ethan delivered another blow to the altar, and this time, it shattered. The room was filled with a blinding light, and the whispers stopped abruptly. For a moment, there was silence. And then, a single, clear voice spoke. The cost must be paid. The light began to fade, revealing the chamber once more. The shadows were gone, but the air felt heavy, charged with an unnatural energy. Ethan dropped the journal, staring at the broken altar. We did it, he said, his voice barely above a whisper. But Sarah wasn't so sure. The carvings on the walls were still glowing, and the voice echoed again. The cost must be paid. Ethan turned to Sarah, his face pale. It's me, he said. It's asking for me. No, Sarah said, shaking her head. We'll find another way. There is no other way, Ethan said. The journal said the woods take. They've been taking people for years. If I don't stay, it'll take both of us or worse. Tears streamed down Sarah's face. Ethan, no, we can figure this out together. Ethan smiled faintly. You have to go. Sarah, you have to get out of here. Don't look back. Before she could stop him, Ethan stepped toward the altar. The glowing cracks began to pulse, and the chamber filled with light once more. Sarah ran. She didn't know where she was going, but her instincts screamed at her to keep moving. The woods were silent now, the whispers gone, the shadows no longer followed her, and the air felt lighter, less oppressive. When she finally stumbled out of the tree line, the sun was rising. She collapsed on the ground, gasping for air, and looked back at the woods. But all she saw were trees. Weeks passed, but Sarah couldn't shake the memory of what had happened. The woods remained silent, and no one else disappeared. But Ethan was gone, and no one in Black Hollow seemed to remember him. The whispers had stopped, but sometimes, in the dead of night, Sarah thought she could hear his voice. Don't look back. And she never did. If you like this story, don't forget to hit the like button, share and subscribe the channel. Help us grow. Thanks for watching.